Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast, unexplored ocean, clutching a parchment map that fades into swirling ink and cryptic warnings. To your left, a dragon coils around an unnamed island. To your right, the words, "Here be monsters," hover over uncharted waters. This wasn't just fantasy, it was reality for medieval mapmakers, the daring cartographers who bridged the gap between the known world and the terrifying unknown. Their maps weren't mere tools for navigation. They were masterpieces of art, science, and sheer human imagination, where every stroke of the quill held secrets, fears, and dreams of a world still being discovered. What if I told you that these ancient maps were more than just directions? They were time capsules, capturing the hopes and anxieties of an era when the Earth's edges were shrouded in mystery. Medieval cartographers didn't just draw coastlines, they wove legends into parchment, blending hard-won geographical knowledge with myths whispered by sailors and scholars alike. A single map could tell a story of faith, with Jerusalem at the center of the world, or hint at unexplored lands where giants and golden cities might lie waiting. These weren't mistakes or flights of fancy, they were reflections of a world where the line between fact and folklore was beautifully, intentionally blurred. So how did these mapmakers chart what they couldn't see? What drove them to fill the blank spaces with beasts and wonders, and why do their creations still captivate us centuries later? In this journey through the mysteries of medieval cartography, we'll uncover the ingenious techniques they used to code the hidden symbols in their work and explore how their visions of the world's edge shaped history itself. From the sprawling mappa mundi to the precision of Portolan charts, these maps were more than guides, they were declarations of human curiosity, courage, and the unshakable belief that there was always something more to discover. Ready to step into their world, let's begin. Medieval mapmakers weren't just draftsmen, they were storytellers, theologians, and philosophers wielding quills instead of swords. Picture a Benedictine monk hunched over a candlelit desk in a secluded scriptorium, painstakingly inking the contours of continents he'd never seen, or an Arab scholar in Cordoba, stitching together accounts from Silk Road merchants and Ptolemy's ancient texts. These weren't neutral observers, they were interpreters of a world where every mountain range might hide the Garden of Eden and every ocean whispered of divine judgment. Their tools were shockingly simple: compasses for circles, straight edges for lines, and a patchwork of second-hand travelers' tales that blurred like fog on the horizon. Yet with these, they crafted visions of the cosmos where geography and theology danced together. Take the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, a sprawling 13th century masterpiece that places Jerusalem at the center of the world like a jewel. Around it swirl rivers of paradise, the Tower of Babel, and even the mythical land of the Amazons. This wasn't a failure of accuracy, it was a deliberate choice. For medieval thinkers, space and spirit couldn't be separated. A map wasn't complete unless it showed Noah's Ark resting on Mount Ararat or marked the lurking places of Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic tribes said to be trapped beyond the Caucasus. These elements weren't decorations, they were moral signposts reminding viewers that every journey, whether across land or through life, was ultimately a pilgrimage. But not all mapmakers worked in quiet cloisters. Some were adventurers themselves, like the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, who crafted the Tabula Rogeriana for the Norman King Roger II of Sicily in the 12th century. Combining Greek science, Islamic astronomy, and first-hand reports from sailors, His work was astonishingly precise for its time, yet even he included phantom islands and legendary kingdoms. Why? Because medieval cartography thrived on a delicate tension, the hunger for empirical truth versus the awe of the unexplored. A map might carefully chart the Mediterranean's trade winds in one corner, then fade into a margin scribbled with sea serpents and the warning, "Beyond this point, no one returns." What's truly remarkable is how these diverse creators, monks, merchants, and polymaths shared a common language of symbols. Dragons marked the limits of human knowledge. Golden cities shimmered at the edges, taunting explorers with promises of wealth. Even the winds were personified as cherubic faces puffing gusts across parchment. This visual shorthand wasn't just whimsy, it was a survival tactic. In an age when few could read, a snarling beast or an angel's trumpet conveyed dangers and wonders faster than any written legend. Today, we'd call it user experience design medieval style. Behind every stroke of ink lay a paradox. These mapmakers documented a world they believed was finite, yet their own work hinted at infinite mysteries. They drew the edges of the earth with one hand while leaving the other hand open, beckoning future generations to step beyond them. To craft their astonishing maps, medieval cartographers relied on a humble yet ingenious toolkit, far removed from today's satellites and GPS. Imagine a world where every coastline, every mountain had to be plotted by hand, guided by little more than the stars and the whispers of travelers. The compass, a revolutionary import from China, helped them orient their work to magnetic north, while the astrolabe, a marvel of Islamic astronomy, allowed them to measure the angle of the sun or stars against the horizon. But these tools alone couldn't capture the vastness of the world, so mapmakers turned to something even more powerful, the collective memory of merchants, pilgrims, and sailors. A single map might stitch together a Venetian trader's description of the Black Sea, a monk's sketch of the Holy Land, and a Norse explorer's tale of icy northern waters. Precision was often sacrificed for practicality. Distances were estimated in days of travel rather than miles, leading to comical distortions like England squashed into a tiny rectangle or the Mediterranean stretched like taffy. Yet these errors reveal a deeper truth. Medieval maps weren't meant to be scaled blueprints. They were narrative tapestries where a city's importance might be shown by its size on parchment rather than its actual geography. Take the Ebstorf Mappa Mundi, where Christ's body literally embraces the world, his hands, feet, and head marking the edges of creation. Theology dictated proportions. Jerusalem swelled to the center, while Europe shrank to the margins. The materials themselves were works of art. Parchment, made from scraped animal hide, was precious and prone to warping. Ink was mixed from oak galls and iron salts, creating a rich brown black that faded into ghosts over centuries. Gold leaf might highlight holy sites, while lapis lazuli ground from Afghan gemstones painted rivers and seas in dazzling blue. Every stroke was deliberate, every color symbolic. Red could mark martyrdom sites, green might signify paradise and monstrous sea creatures. Those weren't just decoration. They signaled real dangers like whirlpools or reefs, disguised as folklore to stick in the mind of illiterate sailors. What's most striking is how these mapmakers turned limitation into creativity. Lacking satellite imagery, they drew winds as cherubs puffing cheeks. With no concept of longitude, they organized space by biblical time, placing Eden in the east, where the sun rose, and the apocalyptic lands of Gog and Magog in the distant north. Even their copies of older maps weren't mere reproductions. Each iteration added new layers of meaning, like a palimpsest of human curiosity. A 13th-century monk might trace a Roman road from a crumbling scroll, then scribble in the latest rumor of a dragon-haunted island from a passing merchant. In the end, these techniques created maps that were less about navigation and more about meditation. A single sheet of parchment could guide a soul through salvation history, from Adam's fall to the Last Judgment, all while hinting at uncharted wonders just beyond the edge. The monsters in the margins weren't mistakes, they were invitations. For in a world where the unknown was vast and terrifying, the mapmaker's greatest skill wasn't accuracy. It was the courage to say, "Here the story continues." The phrase, "Here be dragons," may be more legend than literal, but the spirit behind it pulses through every inch of medieval cartography. Those swirling sea serpents and dog-headed men lurking at the edges of maps weren't just flights of fancy, they were coded messages, a visual language for dangers both real and imagined. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a flashing "danger ahead" sign, but painted with the vivid brushstrokes of cultural fears and spiritual awe. A dragon coiled around an island didn't just mark treacherous waters, it whispered of humanity's fragile grasp on a world still brimming with divine secrets. This symbolism wasn't random. Monsters clustered where knowledge frayed beyond the pillars of Hercules, deep in African deserts or in the icy mists of the north. The Hereford Mappamundi, for instance, tucks a gang of one-eyed giants into Scythia's mountains, while the Carta Marina drapes Scandinavia in tentacled horrors. These weren't arbitrary placements. They echoed ancient texts like Pliny's Natural History, where distant lands supposedly birthed races of people with feet turned backward or faces in their chests. Mapmakers weren't inventing these creatures, they were curating centuries of hearsay into a bestiary of the unknown, but the terror came with tantalizing allure. The same margins that held dragons also cradled rumors of El Dorado like kingdoms or fountains of eternal youth. A sailor might dread the sea monster inked off Portugal's coast, but what if the next wave carried him to St. Brendan's blessed Isle or the gates of Prester John's Christian paradise? This duality reveals the medieval mind's dance with the unexplored, dread and desire twined like vines on a map's border. The blank spaces spoke just as loudly. Where modern maps might label uncharted areas unexplored, medieval cartographers left voids humming with possibility. Some filled them with delicate patterns, like the waves of oblivion on Catalan charts, a visual admission that beyond a certain point, knowledge dissolved into God's domain. Others, like the Vineland Map's Phantom Greenland, stretched geography thin to accommodate fresh discoveries or wishful thinking. These gaps weren't failures, they were invitations. A blank space could mean no one has returned from here or no one has tried hard enough. What's most striking is how these symbols transcended geography. The dragon wasn't just a hazard on a trade route, it was a mirror. It reflected the period's existential anxieties, the fear of divine punishment, the limits of human ambition, even the lurking sin in one's own heart. When a monk drew Satan gnawing at the edges of a mappamundi, he wasn't just mapping hell's location, he was charting the soul's perilous journey through a world thick with temptation. Yet for all their warnings, these maps pulsed with restless curiosity. Every monster was a question mark, every blank space a challenge. They didn't just say, "Turn back," they whispered, "What if?" That tension between warning and wonder is why these maps still grip us. In an age where satellites have stripped the planet of mystery, their inked edges remind us how intoxicating the unknown once was, and how much we've gained and lost by filling it in. Religion didn't just influence medieval maps, it breathed life into them, turning dry parchment into sacred storytelling. Imagine unrolling a map where cities and rivers weren't merely landmarks but waypoints on a spiritual journey. Jerusalem, glowing at the center like a heartbeat, wasn't a cartographic accident. It was a declaration. This is where heaven touched earth, where human history pivoted on divine will. The Hereford Map Mundi, for instance, isn't a navigational aid, it's a visual sermon. Eden floats at the top, cradled like a jewel in the east, while Christ's crucifixion anchors the center. Every mountain and sea isn't just geography. It's a chapter in a cosmic drama with humanity's salvation as the climax. This wasn't just Christian symbolism. Islamic mapmakers like Al-Idrisi wove faith into their work differently. His maps oriented southward, aligning with the Qibla direction of prayer toward Mecca. Rivers might follow the Quran's description of paradise's 4 streams, while distant lands echoed tales from the Hadith. Even the zonal maps of early Muslim scholars divided the world into climes not just by temperature, but by divine design, places where faith could flourish or falter under God's plan. The lines between scripture and science blurred. To chart the earth was to trace the fingerprints of the divine. Biblical events weren't relegated to margins, they shared space with trade routes and kingdoms. Noah's Ark might perch on Armenia's mountains, a stone's throw from real caravan paths. The Red Sea, parted for Moses, could be drawn with walls of water beside accurate coastal depths. These weren't contradictions to medieval minds. Time collapsed on their maps. Past miracles existed alongside present cities because faith was timeless. A pilgrim tracing his finger from London to Jerusalem wasn't just planning a trip. He was retracing salvation history step by step. Theological maps also served as moral compasses. Monsters prowling the edges weren't just exotic beasts, they were incarnations of sin or pagan chaos, reminders that straying too far from God's order invited peril. Some maps even marked the lands of Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic tribes Alexander the Great supposedly trapped behind iron gates. Their presence whispered a warning. The world's edges were fragile and judgment lurked beyond the known. Yet these same maps might frame the earth with Christ's outstretched arms, as in the Ebstorf map, cradling creation in a divine embrace. Danger and grace coexisted in ink and vellum. What's striking is how these maps balanced reverence with curiosity. Even as they honored tradition, they left room for wonder. Empty spaces beyond Africa might hold the cryptic note, the antipodes, do they walk upside down? A tease of possibility that faith and reason could still explore. Medieval cartographers didn't see science and religion as rivals. To them, every discovered island, every corrected coastline, was another verse in the Psalm of creation. Their maps were prayers in parchment form, whispering that to know the world was to glimpse the mind of its maker. This fusion of earth and eternity gave their work staggering emotional weight. A merchant might use a map's coastlines to plot a voyage, but his eyes would linger on Eden's rivers or the Tower of Babel, reminders that wealth meant nothing without wisdom. A king's map, studded with gold-leaf cities, still showed Jerusalem reigning supreme, humbling earthly power before the celestial. In an age where most couldn't read, these visual sermons taught that geography wasn't just about places but purpose. Every road led somewhere, both on land and in the soul. The legacy of these sacred maps lingers in subtle ways. Modern cartography may have stripped away dragons and paradise, but the urge to map meaning onto space hasn't vanished. We still center political maps on our homelands, still project our anxieties onto blank spots like ocean trenches or outer space. The medieval mapmakers knew a truth we sometimes forget. A map is never just a map. It's a mirror reflecting what we worship, what we fear, and where we believe the story of the world and ourselves truly begins. At first glance, the TO map seems almost childlike in its simplicity, a perfect circle sliced by a bold T shape floating in an empty sea of parchment. But this deceptively basic design held the weight of an entire worldview. Imagine holding a medieval map where geography bowed to theology, where every line carried spiritual significance. The circle represented the boundary of creation itself, echoing biblical verses that described the earth as compassed by the waters. The T, formed by the Mediterranean Sea and the rivers Nile and Don, carved the world into three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa, each with its own sacred role in God's plan. Jerusalem's placement at the center wasn't just symbolic, it was a theological anchor. For medieval Christians, this was the axis mundi, the spot where Christ's blood had soaked into the soil, forever sanctifying it as the crossroads of salvation history. Maps like the famous 12th century Soli map didn't just show Jerusalem as a dot, they often enlarged it to dominate the page, its walls etched in gold leaf while other cities shrank into insignificance. Accuracy didn't matter because the TO map wasn't guiding travelers, it was guiding souls, reinforcing the idea that all roads, physical and spiritual, led back to the holy city. The three continents weren't equal in this cosmic hierarchy. Asia, occupying the top half of the circle, held Eden at its eastern edge, a lush garden forever barred by flaming swords. Europe and Africa, squeezed into the lower quarters, carried their own allegories. Europe, home of the church, often faced upward toward salvation, while Africa's southern reaches faded into scorched deserts, sometimes labeled with warnings of monstrous races. Even the rivers were sermons in liquid form. The Nile might twist into the shape of a question mark, as if asking pilgrims to ponder divine mysteries. What's fascinating is how these maps adapted to their audiences. Monastic versions like those in Beatus manuscripts brimmed with apocalyptic imagery, the four horsemen galloping along the margins, reminding monks that maps were timelines counting down to Judgment Day. By contrast, royal courts might commission TO maps studded with gem-like cities, subtly flattering rulers by placing their kingdoms closer to Jerusalem's glow. Every variation served a purpose: to make the invisible order of the universe visible, tangible. Yet the TO map's greatest power lay in its flexibility. As new knowledge trickled in from crusaders, traders, and explorers, cartographers didn't abandon the design, they stretched it. Some added a fourth continent, a shadowy terra incognita lurking beyond the circle. Others twisted the T into a Y, acknowledging that the Nile and Don didn't neatly meet the Mediterranean. These weren't contradictions but evolutions, proving that even the most symbolic maps couldn't ignore the tug of discovery. By the late Middle Ages, the TO map began to fade, replaced by Portolan charts and Ptolemaic grids, but its legacy endured in unexpected ways. The very phrase, "to orient," comes from aligning maps with the East, where medieval cartographers placed paradise. Modern atlases may scoff at its distortions, yet we still center political maps on our homelands, still project our beliefs onto blank spaces. The TO map's genius was recognizing that every map, no matter how scientific, is ultimately a story, and medieval storytellers knew exactly where the plot began. At the center of it all, where heaven and earth once touched, Marco Polo's travelogue wasn't just a bestseller, it was a seismic shock to medieval mapmakers. When his descriptions of Kublai Khan's court or the spice-scented ports of Java reached Europe, they didn't slot neatly into existing maps. They exploded like fireworks over a carefully inked parchment, forcing cartographers to grapple with a dilemma: cling to ancient authorities like Ptolemy, or make space for these bewildering new truths. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the first world maps to absorb Polo's accounts, captures this tension perfectly. It shows the great Khan enthroned in Cathay with startling accuracy, Yet just beyond his borders, the page dissolves into gold-leafed legends of men with umbrella feet and trees that sprout lambs. Exploration didn't just expand the map, it stretched the medieval imagination to its limits. Sailors played an equally revolutionary role, especially those braving the Atlantic's foggy margins. Irish monks whispering of St. Brendan's mythical island or Norse sagas describing Vineland's grassy shores trickled into Portolan charts, the medieval GPS of their day. These weren't dry coordinates, they were stories stitched into coastlines, a sailor's tale of spotting floating mountains of ice near Greenland might morph into a map's jagged dragon teeth guarding the north. Yet hidden beneath the folklore were real navigational clues, the infamous Island of Demons off Canada's coast, where 15th century maps warned of shrieking spirits. Historians now suspect it marked the eerie cries of walruses echoing through Arctic mist, a practical warning dressed in supernatural garb. The real magic happened when explorers and scholars collided. Take the Fra Mauro map of 1459, a sprawling masterpiece that blended Venetian merchant reports with Arabic astronomy. Mauro scrawled disclaimers like, "I do not confirm this, but only report it," next to descriptions of African kingdoms, showcasing a new skepticism. Yet he still drew the Garden of Eden in delicate ink, floating just beyond India. This was cartographic bilingualism, speaking the language of both faith and facts. Even as maps grew more accurate, they kept one foot in the realm of wonder, because exploration hadn't just revealed new lands, it had revealed how much more there was to dream. The push-pull between tradition and discovery played out in tiny, telling details. A map might use precise cross-hatching for a well-documented coastline, then abruptly switch to swirling, tentative strokes where the unknown began. Some cartographers resorted to clever compromises, placing newly discovered lands like the Azores in the margins, as if not quite ready to commit them to the main canvas. Others, like the German monk Martin Behaim, went all in. His Erdapfel globe of 1492 boldly included Japan, then known only from Marco Polo's hearsay as a sizable island east of China. Columbus allegedly carried this globe in his mind when he sailed west, proving how maps didn't just reflect exploration, they fueled it. What's poignant is how these maps capture the human cost of expansion. Beneath the inked monsters and gold-leafed cities were real people, often unnamed, whose voyages ended in shipwrecks or worse. The blank spaces weren't just voids, they were silences where voices had vanished. Yet each returning traveler, whether a Venetian merchant or a Basque whaler, added another piece to the puzzle. By the late 15th century, the old TO maps looked increasingly cramped, their tidy divisions buckling under the weight of new continents. The world was outgrowing its medieval frame, and the maps knew it before the scholars did. They became living documents, their edges fraying with possibility, whispering that the greatest monsters weren't in the seas, but in the fear of leaving the familiar behind. Among the most tantalizing legends etched onto medieval maps was the kingdom of Prester John, a Christian monarch said to rule a land shimmering with emerald rivers and towers of solid crystal. This wasn't just wishful thinking, it was geopolitical hope inked onto parchment. When rumors of this pious king reached Europe in the 12th century, they struck like lightning. Here was a potential ally, a beacon of faith in the distant east, surrounded by the rising tide of Islamic empires. Mapmakers scrambled to place him somewhere, first in Asia, then later in Africa, as explorers failed to find his jeweled palace. Catalan Atlas of 1380 even shows him enthroned near the Nile, his scepter raised as if blessing the search for his realm. Prester John's kingdom wasn't mere decoration. It was a compass pointing toward salvation in a world that felt increasingly besieged. Equally magnetic was the earthly paradise, often drawn hovering at the map's eastern edge like a forbidden fruit. Unlike the abstract heaven of theology, this was paradise as a place tangible, almost reachable. The Hereford Mappamundi depicts it as a walled garden where Adam and Eve stand beneath a serpent-coiled tree, their faces etched with sorrow. But the mapmaker's genius lies in the details. The paradise is elevated on a mountain, separated from the mortal world by a ring of fire or ocean. This wasn't just biblical storytelling, it was cartographic psychology. By placing Eden just beyond the known, they acknowledged humanity's exile while keeping redemption tantalizingly close. Some maps, like the Ebstorf, went further, showing paradise's four rivers: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, flowing downward into the inhabited world, as if grace itself could be charted like a waterway. Then there were the Phantom Islands, High Brassel off Ireland's coast, St. Brendan's Isle in the Atlantic, or the vanishing land of Friesland near Iceland. These weren't mistakes but placeholders for possibility. When Venetian navigators claimed to spot High Brassel emerging from the mist every 7 years, mapmakers dutifully included it, often with a note: "Island sometimes visible." The Zeno map of 1458 even gave Friesland a jagged coastline and fictional towns, borrowing names from real Scandinavian settlements. These inventions weren't deceit, they were hypotheses waiting to be tested. After all, if the Canary Islands could be real, why not others? The roots of these myths ran deep. Some sprouted from ancient texts like Pliny's accounts of dog-headed men or Herodotus' tales of gold-digging ants. Others grew from garbled traveler reports like the likely origin of the monoculi, one-eyed giants said to inhabit Ethiopia. Historians now suspect these stemmed from encounters with tribesmen holding shields decorated with single-eye motifs. Even Marco Polo's description of the roc, a bird so vast it could lift elephants, probably echoed sightings of Madagascar's extinct elephant birds. The mapmaker's challenge was sorting revelation from rumor, a task as delicate as separating gold dust from sand. What's remarkable is how these mythical lands served practical purposes. The Isle of Demons off Newfoundland, where 16th century maps warned of whaling spirits, may have discouraged rival ships from profitable fishing grounds. The land of the Amazons, often placed near the Black Sea, wasn't just Greek myth recycled. It marked territories where nomadic women rode horseback, flipping patriarchal expectations on their head. These weren't pure fantasies, they were reflections of real cultural collisions, distorted through the lens of medieval worldview. The true magic lies in how these legends evolved. Prester John's kingdom drifted across continents like a mirage. Eden shrank from a physical location to a theological concept as exploration chipped away at the unknown. Yet, even as the myths faded, their essence endured: the human need to fill voids with stories. Today's maps may have traded dragons for grid coordinates, but the impulse remains. We still whisper of Atlantis in ocean trenches or imagine civilizations beneath Antarctica's ice. The medieval mapmakers understood something we sometimes forget. A map without mysteries isn't just accurate. It's incomplete. The ocean on a medieval map wasn't just empty blue. It was a stage for nightmares and wonders, teeming with creatures that defied nature. A sailor's finger tracing a route might pause where inked tentacles coiled around a ship, or where a beast with the body of a fish and the face of a lion gnashed its teeth. These weren't doodles to fill space, they were calculated warnings, a visual language for dangers no compass could predict. Take the Carta Marina of 1539, where the waters off Scandinavia writhe with serpents so detailed you can almost hear their hisses. One monster, labeled Hyena of the Sea, drags sailors into the depths, a chilling metaphor for the ocean's hunger. But why monsters? The answer lies in the medieval mind's collision of faith, fear, and fledgling science. The sea was the last great wilderness, a place where storms could swallow fleets and God's wrath seemed to churn in the waves. Mapmakers, often cloistered scholars who'd never sailed, relied on sailors' tales, and sailors, facing endless horizons, spun stories to explain the unexplained. A breaching whale became an island-sized demon. The eerie glow of bioluminescence that was the eyes of submerged dragons. Even real hazards like reefs or whirlpools got mythic makeovers because a sailor would remember to avoid the jaws of Leviathan far quicker than a latitude scrawled in Latin. Religion seeped into these depictions too. The whale that swallows Jonah wasn't just a Bible story, it was a template. Many sea monsters echo the Book of Job's description of Behemoth and Leviathan, cosmic chaos beasts only God could tame. Drawing them on maps reinforced a potent idea: the ocean was a testing ground for faith. Navigators didn't just battle wind and wave, they wrestled with divine mysteries. Some charts even showed angels hovering above storms, a reminder that survival depended on grace as much as skill. Yet amid the terror, there's a thread of awe. The same maps that warned of monsters also marveled at nature's oddities. The sea monk, a creature with a tonsured head and fishtail, might mock clergy or hint at real encounters with walruses bobbing vertically. The bishop fish, complete with a mitre-like fin, blurred the line between miracle and zoology. These weren't pure fabrications, they were attempts to categorize the uncanny, much like early scientists pressing strange plants into herbals. When a map labeled a creature as large as a mountain, it wasn't just exaggeration, it was the birth of a scientific impulse, straining to measure the immeasurable. The monsters also served as cultural Rorschach tests. Norse maps teemed with serpents from their sagas, while Arab charts might feature the monstrous behemoth, a fish holding up the world. Even the "here be dragons" trope is revealing. The phrase appears exactly once on a single 16th century globe, yet it's become shorthand for medieval cartography's romance with danger. The truth is subtler. Each monster was a mirror reflecting local fears. Mediterranean maps warned of Scylla and Charybdis, while Atlantic charts whispered of krakens capable of dragging entire ships into the abyss. What's most striking is how these creatures evolved alongside exploration. As voyagers proved the seas lacked literal dragons, the monsters didn't vanish, they migrated. Later maps pushed them to the edges, into the Arctic whirlpools or the Pacific's uncharted vastness. They became placeholders for the remaining mysteries, a nod to the fact that even in an age of growing knowledge, the ocean kept its secrets. Today, we've swapped ink monsters for sonar blips and deep sea camera feeds, but the allure remains. The medieval mapmakers knew something we still feel. The deepest waters will always hold shadows, and the human imagination will always sail into them, equal parts dread and wonder. Unfolding the Hereford Map Mundi is like cracking open a medieval encyclopedia, except this one stretches over 5 feet of calfskin parchment, with every inch pulsing with stories. Picture a world where Jerusalem sits dead center, not as a dot on a grid, but as a radiant heart pumping spiritual meaning through inked veins. The map's creator, likely a team of scribes working under master theologian Richard of Holdingham, didn't just plot cities, they wove an entire cosmic drama. Adam and Eve huddle eastward near Eden's walled garden, while Christ presides at the top like a celestial stage director, his hand blessing the unfolding narrative below. What's startling is how seamlessly the real and imagined coexist. London and Paris appear as tiny castles, dwarfed by the Tower of Babel's spiraling grandeur. The Red Sea isn't just a body of water, its painted blood red, forever parted for Moses' escape. Even the margins hum with activity. A pygmy battles a crane near Ethiopia, while the mythical races Herodotus described, dog-headed cynosfolly, umbrella-footed cyopods, crowd the edges like a carnival of human possibility. This wasn't carelessness with geography, it was a deliberate hierarchy. Places gained prominence based on their spiritual weight, not their physical size. The map's circular shape is no accident. It mirrors the medieval belief in divine order, a cosmos bounded by God's perfection. Outside that circle, only faint sketches of waves and the ominous phrase, Oceanus et finis terrae, the ocean and the end of the world. Yet within those boundaries, time collapses. Noah's Ark rests atop Mount Ararat just south of the crucifixion, as if biblical past and salvational future occupy the same breath. This fluidity reveals a mindset where history wasn't linear but layered, like pages of a manuscript held up to the light. Navigating the Mappa Mundi requires understanding its visual shorthand. Paradise appears as a fortified island at the very top, accessible only by a bridge labeled the Narrow Path. The Mediterranean Sea forms a vertical blue stripe, not because it's shaped like a ruler, but because it divides the three known continents, Asia looming largest as the cradle of humanity. Even the winds get personality, drawn as cherubic faces puffing gusts from the corners. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were memory aids for an audience more familiar with stained glass than spreadsheets. Beneath the artistry lies a stealthy political agenda. Notice how England, though tiny, wears a crown-like cluster of castles, while Rome's papal authority radiates through crossed keys. The map subtly reinforces power structures, showing Christendom as the inheritor of biblical glory. Yet it's not all dogma, there's playful curiosity too. A note near Scandinavia reads, "Here the people live by hunting and wear animal skins," revealing medieval Europe's fascination with cultural difference. What makes the Hereford Mappa Mundi endure isn't its accuracy, it's its audacity. This was a map that dared to ask, what does the world mean, not just where are the roads? In an age before satellites, it acknowledged that every cartographer faces a choice. Draw only what you can prove, or include what you believe must exist. The Hereford creators chose belief, and in doing so, left us not just a map, but a medieval mind caught mid-dream where every monster at the edge whispers, the story isn't finished yet. The Ebstorf map wasn't just a depiction of the world, it was a revelation in calfskin and ink, where geography and theology fused into something breathtaking. Imagine unrolling a map where Christ's body literally embraced creation, his head rising in the east near Eden, his hands stretching north and south, and his feet resting in the west. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was a visual sermon declaring that every mountain, river, and city existed within the divine presence. Created around the 13th century by German nuns in the Benedictine convent of Ebstorf, this masterpiece stretched nearly 12 feet across, a tapestry of faith as much as cartography. Unlike the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which placed Jerusalem at the center, the Ebstorf map made Christ himself the axis. His wounds became landmarks. The crucifixion at Golgotha marked Jerusalem, while his side's wound might align with the Jordan River, turning salvation history into a literal landscape. The effect was profound. To trace a route on this map wasn't just navigation, it was pilgrimage, a reminder that every journey unfolded under sacred watch. Even the oceans weren't empty. They teemed with creatures both real and mythical, each a testament to God's boundless creativity. What made the Ebstorf map extraordinary was its layered storytelling. Scenes from the Bible, Jonah swallowed by the whale, the Tower of Babel's collapse appeared alongside contemporary cities like Rome and Alexandria. time collapsed just as it did in medieval liturgy, where past and present merged in worship. The map's margins burst with allegory. The four rivers of paradise became veins of grace, while the winds were rendered as angels' breath, guiding sailors and saints alike. This wasn't escapism. It was a declaration that the material world pulsed with spiritual meaning. Tragically, the original Ebstorf map was lost in the flames of World War II, a casualty of the very human chaos it sought to transcend. But reconstructions based on pre-war photographs preserve its genius. One detail stands out. Near Christ's right hand, the map labels the edge of the world with the phrase, Ultima Terra, the last land. Yet even there, the inked lines quiver with possibility, as if to say the divine plan extends beyond human comprehension. The map's creation by nuns adds another layer of wonder. In an era when women's intellectual contributions were often sidelined, these Benedictine sisters wielded quills like theologians, stitching scripture into geography. Their work challenges the stereotype of medieval maps as crude or fanciful. Every monster, every golden city was a deliberate choice, a way to make the invisible visible. To study the Ebstorf map is to witness medieval minds wrestling with the sublime, not through dry doctrine, but through color, symbol, and sheer artistic daring. Its legacy whispers through modern cartography in unexpected ways. When we center political maps on our homelands or mark sacred sites with special icons, we're echoing the Ebstorf's instinct that maps are never neutral. Their arguments about what matters, whose stories get told, and where the boundaries of the possible lie. The nuns of Ebstorf understood that to map the world was to take a stand, not just about its shape but about its soul. The Catalan Atlas unfolds like a visual manifesto of a world in flux, where the measured lines of emerging science collide with the gold-leafed dreams of medieval imagination. Crafted in 1375 by the Majorcan cartographer Abraham Cresques, this masterpiece wasn't just a map, it was a cultural crossroads, stitching together the practical knowledge of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars with the whispers of Silk Road merchants and Atlantic sailors. What sets it apart is its audacious duality. The Mediterranean's coastlines are rendered with startling precision, lifted from portolan charts used by actual navigators, while the Sahara blooms with a towering figure of Mansa Musa, the Malian emperor, seated atop a golden throne. Here, geography and legend weren't at war. They were collaborators, each telling a part of the story the other couldn't yet explain. Look closer, and the atlas reveals its genius in layers. The winds, those ever-present medieval cherubs, still puff their cheeks across the parchment, but now they share space with compass roses and room lines, the tools of a new age of navigation. The Indian Ocean, once a blank space swirling with monsters, now bustles with the sails of Arab dhows and Chinese junks, their routes traced from real accounts like Marco Polo's travels. Yet Cresques couldn't resist adding a few enigmas. The islands of the Atlantic tilt into the unknown, some labeled with tantalizing notes like, "Here lies the Isle of Brassel, visible only to the pure of heart." This wasn't carelessness, it was cartographic honesty. The atlas acknowledged that even as knowledge expanded, mystery persisted. The true revolution lies in the atlas's treatment of Africa. Earlier maps had shrunk the continent into a symbolic sliver, but Cresques, armed with accounts from trans-Saharan caravans, drew it vast and vibrant. The Niger River curves with topographic accuracy, while the Atlas Mountains rise in jagged brown strokes. Most striking is Mansa Musa's depiction, a nod to his legendary 1424 pilgrimage to Mecca, where his caravan's gold supposedly crashed economies along the way. By including him, the atlas did something radical. It centered Africa not as a peripheral oddity, but as a powerhouse of wealth and culture. This wasn't just mapping, it was diplomacy on parchment, challenging Eurocentric worldviews before the Renaissance even began. Yet the atlas never fully sheds its medieval skin. Jerusalem still glows near the center, albeit slightly off-axis, as if caught between spiritual and geographic truth. The Caspian Sea stubbornly remains oval-shaped, a holdover from Ptolemy's ancient eras. Even the Red Sea, painted a lurid scarlet as tradition demanded, splits like a wound across the page. These weren't oversights, they were compromises, a master cartographer balancing the weight of authority against the thrill of discovery. What makes the Catalan Atlas a bridge between eras is its quiet confidence in progress. Unlike earlier Mappa Mundi, which framed the world as a completed divine plan, Cresques left room for revision. Blank spaces murmur potential, not fear. The winds may still blow as angelic faces, but their breath now fills the sails of ships heading somewhere new. Holding this atlas, you sense the medieval mind awakening to a startling idea, that the world might be bigger than the books said, and that its edges, once sealed by God's hand, were now seams waiting to be unpicked. The monsters weren't gone, they'd just retreated to deeper waters, leaving maps like this one to chart the fragile, glorious space between what was known and what might yet be found. To the medieval mind, the stars didn't just twinkle above the earth, they pulled its strings. Unroll a map like the 15th century, zodiacal planisphere, and you'll find the constellations aren't confined to the margins, they're woven into the very fabric of the land. Aries might govern the winds battering Europe's coast, while Scorpio's claws clutch the deserts of North Africa. This wasn't decoration, it was a cosmic blueprint, a belief that the heavens sculpted mountains, directed rivers, and even whispered into the ears of kings. Astrology didn't just influence medieval maps, it animated them, turning parchment into a stage where celestial and earthly dramas played out in unison. The zodiac's presence on maps wasn't arbitrary. Each sign ruled over specific regions, a system borrowed from ancient texts like Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. Libra's scales might hover over Italy, suggesting balance in governance, while fiery Leo roared across the Sahara, explaining its scorching heat. These weren't vague metaphors. Sailors consulted maps with lunar phases to time voyages, believing tides and storms answered to the moon's phases. Even the Hereford Mappa Mundi, for all its biblical focus, tucked the 12 zodiac signs around its edges like celestial sentinels, acknowledging that faith and astrology could share the same parchment without contradiction. Planetary alignments held equal weight. The climata maps divided the world into latitudinal zones, each governed by a planet. Saturn's melancholy sway over the frigid north explained the savage tribes said to dwell there, while Jupiter's benevolent rule blessed Mediterranean kingdoms with temperate climates. This wasn't superstition, it was proto-science, an attempt to systemize the chaos of nature. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, some mapmakers blamed a rare conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in 1345, inking ominous star clusters near afflicted cities. The sky wasn't just a canopy, it was a clockwork of cause and effect. The most striking fusion of astrology and geography lies in the TO map's hidden geometry. Their circular form didn't just mirror the Earth's shape, it echoed the medieval vision of the universe itself. Concentric spheres with Earth at the center, each planet orbiting in its own crystalline shell. Jerusalem's central placement wasn't just spiritual, it aligned with the Aristotelian concept of the sublunary world, where the moon marked the boundary between celestial perfection and earthly flux. Even the four rivers flowing from Eden mirrored the four humors of the body, tying microcosm to macrocosm in one grand design. Yet astrology's role wasn't static. As the Renaissance dawned, maps like Andreas Wolfsberger's 1448 world chart began divorcing zodiac symbols from geography, relegating them to decorative borders. The stars didn't vanish, they shifted, becoming tools for navigation rather than omens. The same constellations that once dictated harvest seasons now guided caravels across uncharted oceans. This tension between astrology as fate and astrology as calculation mirrored the medieval world's slow pivot toward empiricism. The sky hadn't changed, but humanity's gaze had. What lingers is the haunting beauty of these astral cartographic hybrids. They remind us that every map is a confession of beliefs, not just about the lay of the land, but about our place in the cosmos. To trace a medieval map's inked constellations is to touch a world view where every mountain, every storm, every kingdom trembled under the same celestial symphony. We may have stopped blaming Mars for wars or Venus for love, but the impulse remains to look up, to connect, to find meaning in the dance of light above our heads. The stars have fallen silent, but the maps still whisper their old, enchanted truths. Medieval mapmakers stood at a crossroads between reverence for ancient wisdom and the demands of their own faith, clutching fragments of classical knowledge like precious shards of a broken mirror. Ptolemy's geography, written in the 2nd century, was their holy grail, a scientific masterpiece describing the world through grids of latitude and longitude. But by the time these texts reached medieval Europe, they'd been copied, translated, and sometimes mangled across centuries. Imagine a Benedictine monk in Normandy unrolling a Greek manuscript he couldn't fully read, squinting at star charts that placed the Earth at the center of the cosmos, and wondering how to square this pagan science with Genesis. The result, maps that fused Ptolemy's mathematics with biblical narratives, like a 13th century Mappa Mundi that stretched Africa into a distorted crescent to make room for the Garden of Eden at the top. The struggle wasn't just about accuracy, it was a battle of worldviews. Ptolemy's calculations suggested the Earth was a sphere, but some church fathers like Lactantius had mocked the idea, insisting scripture described a flat world under a firmament. Mapmakers navigated this tension with creative compromises. The TO maps, for instance, kept the Earth's circular shape from classical astronomy, but crammed continents into a symbolic trifold division that prioritized theology over topography. Even when Arab scholars like al-Idrisi preserved Ptolemy's work with stunning precision, European cartographers often cherry-picked details, embracing his coordinates for the Mediterranean while ignoring his insistence that the Indian Ocean was landlocked. The past wasn't just lost, it was selectively remade. Rediscoveries could spark revolutions. When Byzantine scholars brought Ptolemy's original texts to Italy in the 14th century, it was like handing medieval Europe a forgotten user manual for the planet. Suddenly, maps like the Fra Mauro of 1459 began tentatively sketching Africa as a continent that might stretch southward beyond the equator, defying the old belief that the tropics were uninhabitable, burning zones. Yet even these breakthroughs were tinged with hesitation. Fra Mauro scrawled disclaimers like, "I do not confirm this, but leave it to the judgment of explorers," next to his most daring strokes, a testament to the weight of tradition. What's fascinating is how these medieval scholars became detectives of the ancient world, piecing together clues from shards of knowledge. A scrap of Ptolemy's work might surface in a monastery in Toledo, only to be stitched together with Arabic star charts and Viking sailing logs. The Cotton World Map, for example, layered Roman roads over biblical sites and Norse sagas, creating a palimpsest of human curiosity. This wasn't ignorance, it was resourcefulness, a testament to the hunger for understanding even when the tools were flawed. The true legacy of this collision between old and new knowledge lies in its humility. These mapmakers knew they stood on the shoulders of giants, yet they dared to question where those giants had stumbled. When they inked dragons at the edges of their parchment, it wasn't just because they feared the unknown, it was because they acknowledged how much they still had to learn. In an age before satellites, their greatest insight might have been this: that every map is provisional, a snapshot of human understanding poised on the brink of the next great discovery. The Crusades didn't just reshape kingdoms, they redrew the very maps of medieval Europe. When knights, merchants, and pilgrims surged eastward toward Jerusalem, they carried more than swords and crosses. They carried blank parchments and hungry minds. Returning crusaders hauled back treasures far more valuable than gold: Arab star charts, Byzantine portolans, and first-hand accounts of lands that had been mere legends in European scriptoria. Suddenly, the Holy Land wasn't just a symbol in a sermon. It was a real place with measurable roads, bustling ports, and mountains that didn't match the old TO maps at all. One of the most startling revelations was the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography, not through dusty monastic libraries, but through vibrant Arab scholarship. In Antioch and Tripoli, European scholars pored over Arabic translations of this ancient Greek masterpiece, marveling at its grid of latitudes and longitudes. These weren't just lines on parchment, they were keys to a more precise world. The Tabula Rogeriana, crafted by the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi for the Norman King Roger II of Sicily in the 12th century, became a Rosetta Stone of sorts, blending Islamic astronomical precision with Crusader diaries to create maps where cities like Acre and Damascus appeared in their true relationships for the first time. Yet the Crusaders' maps were never purely scientific. Even as they corrected old errors like shrinking the Mediterranean to its actual size instead of the bloated sausage shape on Roman maps, they smuggled in new myths. The River Jordan might now flow in the right direction, but its banks could still sprout notes about manna falling from heaven. Jerusalem, though now drawn with accurate city walls, might hover a little too large on the page, as if faith refused to surrender entirely to geography. This tension birthed maps like the Cambrai map of the 12th century, where Crusader routes snaked realistically across Anatolia, only to dead end at a paradise drawn as a literal walled garden east of the Euphrates. The Crusades also shattered the old idea that the world's edges were sealed by divine decree. When Crusaders encountered the vastness of the Islamic world, stretching from Spain to Persia, their mental maps stretched too. Suddenly, Africa wasn't just a sliver of desert but a continent teeming with kingdoms like Ethiopia, whose Christian ruler sparked rumors of Prester John's mythical alliance. Asia ballooned beyond the narrow strip of the Holy Land, its spices and silks rewriting European notions of wealth. Even the Atlantic, once the gloomy home of sea monsters, began to look like a gateway rather than a barrier. What's fascinating is how these changes rippled beyond the elite. Ordinary pilgrims returning from Jerusalem brought crude sketches, sometimes just a scrap of leather with a zigzagging coastline, that trickled into local maps. A German monk might adjust his abbey's Mappa Mundi after hearing a knight describe the Dead Sea's salt-heavy waters. A Venetian merchant, having haggled in Antioch's markets, could correct the old Roman trade routes on his portolan charts. This was cartography by crowdsourcing, where every traveler's scribble nudged Europe's worldview closer to reality. Yet for all their new knowledge, medieval mapmakers never fully surrendered to cold empiricism. The Ebstorf map, created after centuries of Crusader contact, still framed the world within Christ's outstretched limbs. The Hereford Mappa Mundi tucked Crusader-held cities like Acre alongside unicorns and cannibals. The old and new coexisted not as contradictions, but as layers of understanding, like a parchment scraped clean and written over, yet still whispering beneath the ink. The Crusades didn't just bring back maps, they brought back the humbling realization that the world was wider, stranger, and more wondrous than even the boldest quill had dared to draw. The Vineland Map hangs in that tantalizing grey area between discovery and deception, a parchment that could rewrite history or prove to be one of cartography's greatest hoaxes. Discovered in 1957, this yellow document stunned scholars with its apparent depiction of Norse settlements in North America, labeled Vineland over a ragged coastline that resembles modern-day Newfoundland. If genuine, it would be the earliest known European map to show the New World, predating Columbus by half a century. But from the moment it surfaced, skepticism clung to it like fog to a Viking longship. The ink seemed too black, the Latin script suspiciously crisp, and the wormholes in the parchment didn't quite align with the medieval book it was supposedly bound with. Carbon dating added fuel to the fire. Initial tests suggested the parchment itself dated to the 1400s, but the ink told a murkier story. Traditional medieval ink, made from oak galls and iron salts, should degrade into a rusty brown over centuries. Yet the Vineland Map's ink remained stubbornly dark, leading some scientists to detect traces of 20th century synthetic compounds. Defenders of the map countered that contamination or unusual preservation conditions could explain the anomaly. Then came the linguistic puzzles. Phrases like "by God's will" accompanying the Vineland label struck scholars as oddly modern for a medieval scribe. The debate grew so heated that one researcher reportedly declared, "This isn't just a map. It's a Rorschach test for historians." What makes the controversy so gripping isn't just the question of authenticity, it's what the map represents. If real, it would confirm Norse sagas describing Leif Erikson's voyages to North America around the year 1000, transforming the Vineland Map into a smoking gun of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. No wonder Icelandic scholars embraced it, while others eyed it with suspicion. The map's murky provenance didn't help. It emerged from a private collection with no clear chain of custody, and its sudden appearance in the mid-20th century, just as interest in Viking archaeology was surging, raised eyebrows. Critics whispered that someone had crafted the perfect artifact for an era hungry for Norse heroes, yet the map's defenders point to eerie accuracies. The coastline's kinked shape mirrors the actual geography of Newfoundland's northern tip, a detail unlikely to be guessed by a forger before underwater surveys confirmed it decades later. The map also includes Greenland with surprising precision, complete with its icy eastern coast knowledge that was hazy even in medieval times. Could a forger have gotten so lucky? Or was this the work of a Norse cartographer working from first-hand accounts, sketching a world far larger than Europe dared to imagine? The allure of the Vineland Map lies in this duality. It dangles the possibility of rediscovered history while embodying the fragility of evidence itself. Medieval maps were often copied, edited, and annotated over generations, leaving palimpsests of truth and myth. Even if the Vineland Map is a forgery, it's a brilliant one, a testament to how convincingly the past can be reconstructed and how desperately we want to believe in lost worlds. Whether it's a medieval masterpiece or an elaborate ruse, the map endures as a mirror reflecting our own hunger for connection across time. Every faded line whispers the same tantalizing question: how much of history is fact, and how much is the stories we're willing to buy? Medieval maps may have gotten the coastlines wrong, but they got something far more profound right: the idea that a map is never just about geography. It's a canvas for human ambition, fear, and wonder. When Renaissance explorers like Columbus and Magellan set sail, they carried more than updated nautical charts. They carried the medieval obsession with the unknown, now armed with better tools to chase it. Take the Waldseemüller map of 1507, the first to name America. Its graceful curves and precise latitudes owed everything to Ptolemy's rediscovered grids, yet its spirit, the bold claim that blank spaces were meant to be filled, was pure medieval audacity. The symbolic language of those ancient maps didn't vanish, it evolved. The dragons that once guarded the edges of the world morphed into Renaissance cartouches' elaborate banners framing unexplored territories with artistic flourish. Even the TO map's circular motif resurfaced in early globes, where the Earth's spherical shape finally matched the medieval intuition that creation was a unified whole. The Hereford mapper Mundy's habit of marking holy sites with gold leaf, that became the Renaissance's star-shaped fortifications on city plans, signaling strategic importance with the same visual punch. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the medieval willingness to blend disciplines. Maps like the Catalan Atlas didn't just chart land, they wove together astronomy, commerce, and diplomacy. That interdisciplinary boldness inspired figures like Mercator, whose 16th century projection fused math and art to solve the problem of representing a round world on flat paper. Even his famed compass lines echoed the medieval wind roses, those celestial faces guiding sailors toward destiny. Today, traces of medieval thinking lurk in plain sight. Modern subway maps, with their simplified lines and exaggerated angles, owe a debt to the way TO maps prioritized symbolism over scale, fantasy maps in books and games. They're direct descendants of the Hereford's monster-filled margins, proving that the urge to map the imaginary is as old as parchment itself. And when digital maps like Google Earth let us tilt the globe with a finger, we're replaying the medieval dream, to hold the world in our hands not just as it is, but as it might be. The real lesson of medieval cartography isn't in the ink or the vellum. It's in the quiet rebellion of those mapmakers who dared to sketch beyond the edges of knowledge. They understood something we sometimes forget, that every map is a confession of what its maker values, fears, and hopes to find. When we zoom in on satellite imagery today, we're still chasing the same question that haunted the monk in his scriptorium, not just where are we? But what lies beyond? The monsters may be gone, but the mystery remains. Medieval maps worked like psychological blueprints, quietly shaping minds as much as they charted land. Imagine growing up in a world where every map you saw placed Jerusalem at the center like a glowing heart, with Europe and Africa curled around it like obedient children. This wasn't accidental geography. It was a visual catechism teaching that faith, not latitude, defined what mattered. A peasant who'd never traveled beyond his village could unroll a mappa mundi and instantly grasp his place in a divine hierarchy. Eden hovering eastward, hell lurking south, and his own soul somewhere in between. These maps didn't just show the world, they told people how to feel about it. The monsters in the margins played an equally cunning role. Those snarling sea serpents and one-eyed giants weren't just decorations, they were psychological guardrails. By marking the unknown as perilous, mapmakers tapped into primal fears, discouraging wanderlust that might disrupt social order. A merchant eyeing trade routes to Africa would hesitate when his map showed the Sahara crawling with scorpion-tailed men. The message was clear: stay where you belong or risk divine wrath. Yet paradoxically, these same beasts also fed a hunger for wonder. The Carta Marina's tentacled kraken wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation to imagine realms where nature's rules bent. Fear and fascination became two sides of the same coin, minted by the cartographer's quill. Religious symbolism turned maps into spiritual exercises. When the Ebstorf map framed the world within Christ's outstretched limbs, it offered believers a visceral reminder that every mountain and river existed within sacred embrace. Pilgrims tracing routes to Jerusalem weren't just planning trips, they were rehearsing salvation, their fingers moving from sinful peripheries toward holy center. Even the zonal maps of Islamic scholars, dividing the earth into climes of habitability, subtly reinforced the idea that geography reflected God's plan. To consult these maps was to participate in a kind of visual prayer where borders blurred between earth and eternity. The psychological grip of these maps lingered long after their inaccuracies were exposed. Columbus carried medieval-inspired charts that underestimated Earth's size, convincing him Asia lay just beyond the horizon. His stubborn belief wasn't naivety, it was testament to how deeply cartographic conditioning ran. Centuries later, the Mercator projection would inherit this legacy, inflating Europe's size to match its imperial ego. The medieval instinct that maps should teach, not just measure, never truly faded. What's haunting is how these strategies echo today. Modern infographics highlighting climate crises or pandemic spread owe a debt to medieval mapmakers who understood. Show someone where they stand, and you've shown them who they are. The parchment may have swapped for pixels, but the power remains to comfort with order, terrify with chaos, and above all, remind us that every map is ultimately a mirror. The shift from medieval to Renaissance maps wasn't a clean break. It was more like a slow turning of the tide, where old ways of seeing the world lingered even as new discoveries washed over them. Picture a 15th century cartographer hunched over his desk, one hand tracing Ptolemy's ancient coordinates, while the other sketches the freshly reported coastlines of Africa from Portuguese sailors. These mapmakers were Janus-faced, glancing backward at tradition while stepping forward into empiricism. The famous Fra Mauro map of 1459 captures this duality perfectly. Its lavish gold-leafed Jerusalem nods to medieval piety, yet its sprawling Indian Ocean, dotted with islands from Arab traders' accounts, pulses with Renaissance curiosity. Even the map's creator admitted his doubts in marginal notes, scrawling, "I have left some things unresolved for the sake of truth," a humility unheard of in earlier centuries. What fueled this evolution wasn't just better tools, though the rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography and the spread of the printing press were seismic. It was a change in the very purpose of maps. Medieval mappa mundi had been devotional objects, their distortions reflecting spiritual hierarchies, but Renaissance maps became instruments of power and commerce. Venetian merchants needed accurate portolan charts to outmaneuver rivals, while kings like Henry, the navigator of Portugal, demanded precision to plot colonial claims. The Catalan atlas, with its detailed trade winds and gold-marked Saharan routes, wasn't meant for monastery walls. It was a boardroom stratagem inked on vellum. Yet the old symbolic language never fully vanished. Monsters still lurked in Renaissance margins, though now they were pushed to the edges, clinging to uncharted waters like holdouts from a fading dream. The Waldseemüller map of 1507, despite its revolutionary America label, framed the New World with decorative sea creatures straight out of medieval bestiaries. Even Mercator's famed projection, for all its mathematical rigor, kept Jerusalem near the center, not because the data demanded it, but because cultural habits die hard. The real revelation lies in how these hybrid maps mirror the human psyche. The Renaissance mind, much like ours today, could hold contradiction without crumbling. It could measure a coastline with one eye and still glimpse dragons with the other. When we zoom in on a digital globe today, we're heirs to both impulses, the hunger for pixel-perfect accuracy and the thrill of tapping into terra incognita. The mapmakers of this transitional era understood that progress isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning when to consult the stars and when to trust the compass in your hand. Trade routes were the lifeblood of medieval maps, pumping fresh knowledge across continents like a circulatory system of discovery. Picture a caravan winding along the Silk Road, its bundles of silk and spices hiding something far more precious: scribbled notes about mountain passes, river crossings, and cities where the streets supposedly glittered with gold. These scraps of traveler lore trickled into scriptoria and workshops, where mapmakers pored over them like detectives piecing together a global puzzle. The Catalan Atlas, that masterpiece of 14th century cartography, owes its stunning detail of North African trade hubs to Moroccan merchants who whispered secrets to Majorcan cartographers over cups of mint tea. Every line of ink tracing the Niger River or marking Timbuktu's markets was a testament to commerce's power to redraw the world. Yet these merchant tales came with a catch: truth and tall tales traveled shoulder to shoulder along the trade routes. A Persian trader's account of the Indies might accurately describe monsoon winds, then veer into claims of giant ants mining gold in the desert. Mapmakers faced a dilemma: embrace the exotic and risk fantasy, or dismiss it and miss genuine discoveries. The result was maps like the Genos World Map of 1457, where the Volga River's true course snakes past a region labeled, "Here dwell men with faces in their chests." This wasn't carelessness, it was cartographic hospitality, leaving room for the possible alongside the probable. After all, if rhinos could exist as exotic gifts to European kings proved, why not cyclopes? The Silk Road wasn't the only information superhighway. The amber routes of the Baltic, the trans-Saharan caravans, and the spice-laden dhows of the Indian Ocean each contributed their own threads to the tapestry. Venetian merchants brought back not just pepper from Alexandria but also Arab star charts, which fused with Christian cosmology to create hybrid maps like the Medici Atlas. These documents reveal a quiet revolution. Trade wasn't just altering maps' content, it was reshaping their very purpose. No longer solely spiritual guides, they became practical tools for profit. A merchant consulting the Cresques Atlas could plot a course from Majorca to the Malabar coast, calculating risks against potential riches while still stealing glances at the dragon in the margin, just in case. Perhaps the most profound impact of trade was its erosion of old certainties. When Marco Polo's descriptions of Japan's gilded palaces reached Europe, mapmakers couldn't simply slot them into existing frameworks. The world was stretching, and the maps had to stretch with it. Portolan charts, those marvels of medieval navigation, began crowding the edges with new islands and ports, their compass roses spinning like eager weather vanes pointing toward opportunity. Even the Hereford Mappa Mundi, for all its biblical focus, sneaked in a few Silk Road cities, as if admitting that commerce had earned a seat at theology's table. What's mesmerizing is how these trade-infused maps mirror the medieval world's dawning globalization. A single sheet of vellum might combine a German monk's script, an Arab astronomer's coordinates, and a Norse sailor's coastline testament to the quiet collaborations happening in bazaars and shipyards. The monsters didn't vanish, they just retreated to the margins, making space for pepper sacks and porcelain shards. In the end, these maps remind us that curiosity has always been a merchant's best commodity, and every transaction carried the potential to redraw the edges of the known world. The idea that medieval people believed in a flat earth is one of history's most stubborn myths, but it crumbles under the weight of actual evidence. Far from ignorant flat earthers, scholars of the Middle Ages inherited classical Greek knowledge that the earth was spherical. Thinkers like Isidore of Seville in the 6th century and the Venerable Bede in the 8th explicitly described the Earth as a globe, using observations of lunar eclipses and shifting stars to prove their case. Even Dante's Divine Comedy, that towering masterpiece of medieval literature, imagined the Earth as a sphere with hell at its core and heaven beyond the stars. The myth of widespread flat Earth belief says more about modern arrogance than medieval error, a way to paint the past as primitive while ignoring how knowledge ebbs and flows across centuries. So why the confusion? Blame a 19th century fabrication. The flat Earth myth gained traction thanks to writers like Washington Irving, who falsely claimed Columbus had to argue against superstitious sailors terrified of sailing off the edge. In reality, Columbus's opponents weren't flat earthers, they simply thought he'd underestimated the Earth's size, which he had. The myth stuck because it fit a convenient narrative, the Dark Ages as a time of backwardness, contrasted with the Enlightenment of later eras. Yet medieval maps tell a different story. The TO map's circular designs weren't literal flat discs. They were symbolic representations, like modern globes flattened for convenience. Many even included climatic zones, reflecting Aristotle's spherical Earth model. The irony is that some of the loudest flat Earth voices today accuse medieval people of the very ignorance their own ancestors never held. Medieval scholars debated many things: the size of the Earth, the existence of antipodes, but its roundness wasn't one of them. Even the Hereford Mappa Mundi, with its theological focus, assumes a spherical world. Its circular frame mirrors the cosmos, not a pancake planet. The real distortion isn't in the parchment, it's in how we've rewritten history to flatter ourselves. The next time you hear someone scoff at medieval flat earthers, remember, the Middle Ages knew the Earth was round. The question is, why do we keep pretending they didn't? Unrolling a medieval map is like stepping into an illuminated manuscript where geography and artistry collide in a riot of color and symbolism. These weren't sterile documents, but masterpieces painstakingly crafted with pigments worth their weight in gold. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan for the deepest blues, crushed malachite for lush greens, and real gold leaf to make holy cities like Jerusalem gleam as if touched by divine light. Take the Psalter map from 13th century England, its vibrant hues still striking after 7 centuries. The Red Sea literally painted crimson, its waves curling like flames to echo the biblical parting, while paradise blooms in emerald and gold at the world's edge. This wasn't just cartography, it was visual theology where every color carried meaning: blue for divine truth, red for martyrdom, green for renewal. The artistry extended beyond pigments into intricate storytelling. Borders teemed with zodiac signs, wind faces puffing cheeks, and vignettes of daily life. A farmer plowing here, a king holding court there. The Catalan atlas transformed its margins into a medieval comic strip, with camel caravans snaking through Sahara dunes and Mansa Musa enthroned under a golden canopy. Even the lettering was art. Gothic scripts twisted into elaborate initials, place names framed by tiny castles or ships, turning labels into miniature paintings. A single map could take months to complete, with scribes and illustrators working in tandem, their quills and brushes dancing across calfskin vellum so fine you could see the animal's hair follicles. What's mesmerizing is how these maps balanced beauty with function. Those swirling sea monsters weren't just decorative, they marked dangerous currents in a language illiterate sailors could understand. The Hereford Mappa Mundi's labyrinth-like design, though bewildering to modern eyes, organized spiritual knowledge spatially. Saints clustered near paradise, while mythical beasts prowled the sinful margins. This fusion of form and purpose reached its peak in Portolan charts, where compass lines radiated like golden spiderwebs across the page, both guiding navigators and creating hypnotic geometric patterns. The materials themselves were part of the artistry. Parchment, scraped to near translucency, absorbed ink and pigment differently than paper, giving coastlines a velvety depth. Some mapmakers even incorporated precious materials. The Ebstorf map allegedly used threads of real silver to trace rivers, now lost to time. The tactile experience mattered. The whisper of vellum unrolling, the flicker of gold leaf catching candlelight, the scent of oak gall ink. These were objects meant to be performed as much as read, their grandeur underscoring the wealth and piety of their patrons. Perhaps the greatest testament to their artistry is how they transcend time. Modern eyes, accustomed to Google Maps' sterile efficiency, can still feel the awe these maps were designed to evoke. The way a dragon's inked scales seem to shimmer, or how a tiny painted ship cresting a wave pulls you into its journey. They remind us that before maps were tools, they were talismans, windows onto a world where the seen and unseen, the measured and the imagined, coexisted in glorious, messy harmony. In an age of pixels and precision, their hand-drawn imperfections feel like a rebellion, proof that truth can wear many colors, and that sometimes the most accurate map is the one that makes your heart race. Medieval maps whisper secrets to those who know how to look, not just in their coastlines and captions, but in the sly symbols tucked between cities and seas. A dragon might mark more than dangerous waters. It could be a jab at a rival kingdom's navy. A golden Jerusalem radiating like a sun at the world's center wasn't merely spiritual geography. It was propaganda, reinforcing the Church's authority during the Crusades. Even the choice of materials carried meaning. Lapis lazuli blue for the Virgin Mary's cloak, scarlet ink for martyrdom sites, as if the very colors were sermons in pigment. Take the enigmatic Voynich map, a 15th century puzzle where towns are represented not by dots but by tiny allegorical scenes. A castle under siege might signify a real battle, while a shepherd tending sheep could hint at pastoral wealth. These weren't whimsical doodles, they were cartographic winks, allowing mapmakers to smuggle subversive ideas past censors or patrons. A monk inking a mappa mundi might exaggerate the size of his abbey's lands while shrinking a rival's holdings, subtle cartographic gossip scratched onto vellum. Religious codes ran deepest. On the Ebstorf map, Christ's outstretched arms don't just frame the world, they align with the four rivers of Eden, turning geography into a Eucharistic metaphor. The wind heads puffing from the corners, they're not just compass aids, their number 12 echoes the apostles, a silent reminder that even the elements bowed to divine order. Some maps hid Jewish or Islamic symbols in plain sight, like the Catalan Atlas Arabic star charts disguised as decorative flourishes, a quiet act of interfaith scholarship in an age of rising intolerance. Political messages lurked too. The Hereford Mappa Mundi places England conspicuously close to paradise, while France huddles nearer the apocalyptic lands of Gog and Magog. Coincidence unlikely. When the Medici family commissioned Portolan charts, they ensured Florence's trade routes gleamed in gold leaf, while rival Genoa's harbors faded into the background. Maps were medieval PowerPoint slides, slick presentations for kings and popes, where every inked line could flatter or undermine. Even the blank spaces spoke volumes. Empty oceans might bear the phrase, "Here is nothing," less a confession of ignorance than a dare to explorers. A tiny ship sailing off the edge of a page, its sails billowing toward nowhere, wasn't an error. It was an invitation, a challenge to the viewer. You fill in the rest. These silent codes remind us that medieval maps were never passive. They were arguments, prayers, and provocations, their creators wielding quills as deftly as diplomats wielded treaties. To decode them is to overhear a conversation centuries old, where the stakes weren't just accuracy but power, faith, and the very meaning of the world. Medieval maps didn't just chart real coastlines, they laid the foundations for entire imaginary worlds. When J.R.R. Tolkien sketched Middle-earth sweeping landscapes, complete with its ominous "Here be dragons" warnings in the uncharted East, he was channeling the spirit of those old parchment masters. The crumbling edges of his hand-drawn maps, the deliberate gaps where the shadows lie, all echo the medieval tradition of leaving room for mystery. Tolkien, a scholar of Old English, didn't just borrow aesthetics. He absorbed the medieval mindset where every forest could hide elves and every mountain might guard a dormant dragon. The parallels are uncanny. Compare the Hereford mapper Mundy's golden Jerusalem to his glowing Minas Tirith, or the Catalan atlas's sea serpents to the watcher in the water lurking outside Moria. Fantasy didn't just inherit medieval maps' monsters, it inherited their purpose: to make the unknown feel tantalizingly real. Video games have taken this legacy even further. Open-world epics like The Elder Scrolls or The Witcher don't just feature medieval-style maps as menu art. They turn exploration into a spiritual air of medieval cartography. In Skyrim, uncovering a new location often reveals a hand-drawn icon on your map, a crude tower or wolf's head, reminiscent of the symbolic shorthand on Portolan charts. Even the UI design nods to history. Dragon Age, Inquisition's war table missions unfold on a parchment-like map dotted with wax seals and inked annotations, blurring the line between gameplay and artifact. These virtual worlds understand something profound. Medieval maps weren't about accuracy, they were about feeling. A modern gamer squinting at a fog of war-covered minimap is channeling the same thrill and dread as a 15th century sailor eyeing the edge of his chart. The tropes run deeper than aesthetics. Medieval maps' habit of blending fact and fiction birthed fantasy's love of unreliable geography. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire maps Westeros with deliberate inconsistencies. Distances shift between books, and lands beyond the wall grow vaguer the farther north they go, mirroring how medieval accounts distorted Africa's shape or Asia's breadth. Even Harry Potter's Marauders map, with its moving footprints and secret passages, owes a debt to the medieval idea that maps could be magical objects, alive with hidden knowledge. What's most fascinating is how modern fantasy subverts the medieval mold while honoring it. The Legend of Zelda's Hyrule maps retain the TO structure's circular harmony, but replace Jerusalem with the Triforce. Game of Thrones swaps ecclesiastical symbolism for political intrigue. Its iconic opening credits sequence unfolds like a mechanized mapper mundi, where castles rise and fall like chess pieces. Yet the core remains. These maps aren't just guides, they're narratives. A stained corner might hint at a dragon's lair, just as the Hereford mapper mundi used smudged ink to imply uncharted perils. The endurance of this tradition speaks to something primal in storytelling. Medieval maps and modern fantasy both answer the same hunger: to be awed by a world bigger than ourselves, where danger and wonder share the same horizon. Every time a fantasy writer scribbles, "Here be wyverns," or a game designer hides a treasure behind an inked mountain range, they're not just world building, they're keeping a 600-year-old conversation alive. The parchment may have swapped for pixels, but the magic lingers. A great map doesn't just show you where to go, it makes you ache for what might be waiting just beyond the edge. The glow of a smartphone screen might seem worlds apart from candlelit scriptoria, but digital technology has become the unexpected ally of medieval mapmaking. Cutting-edge tools like multispectral imaging can now uncover layers of faded ink on centuries-old parchments, revealing lost details invisible to the naked eye. The Digital Mappimundi project takes this further, stitching together high-resolution scans of maps like the Hereford Mappimundi into interactive experiences where viewers can zoom into brushstrokes or click on sea monsters to hear their legends narrated. Suddenly, what was once confined to museum glass cases becomes a living, explorable universe where a 13th-century monk's quill marks share digital space with modern commentary and scholarly annotations. This marriage of old and new goes beyond preservation. Digital platforms allow side-by-side comparisons previously impossible in physical archives. Imagine toggling between the Ebstorf map's Christocentric worldview and Mercator's scientific projections with a swipe. Augmented reality apps now overlay medieval maps onto modern cityscapes, letting users walk through London as it appeared on the Salter map, where the Thames might swirl with inked serpents while buses rumble past. Even gaming engines have joined the conversation. Historians are using Unity software to reconstruct lost map features in 3D, turning flat parchment dragons into animated creatures that snap at virtual ships. The democratization of these treasures is perhaps the most revolutionary shift. Where once only scholars with white gloves could handle the Catalan atlas, now anyone with an internet connection can explore its gold-leaf details through open-access databases. Crowdsourcing projects invite the public to help transcribe handwritten marginalia, uncovering forgotten place names or merchant notes hidden in ornate borders. Social media accounts like at Medieval Map daily share tantalizing fragments to thousands, sparking debates about whether a certain blotch represents a shipwreck or simply a monk's spilled ink. Yet the digital age hasn't sanitized these maps' mystery, it's amplified it. Spectral imaging sometimes reveals more questions than answers, like erased routes that suggest medieval mapmakers revised their visions as new reports arrived. Algorithmic analysis of trade routes on Portolan charts has uncovered previously unnoticed patterns in red ink pigments, hinting at clandestine exchanges between Christian and Islamic cartographers. Even errors have gained new resonance when GPS coordinates are plotted onto the Vineland Map's disputed coastline. The discrepancies tell a richer story about how knowledge traveled and twisted through premodern networks. The true magic lies in how these tools bridge temporal divides. A child tracing the Hereford Mappimundi's labyrinthine paths on a tablet experiences the same wonder as a medieval pilgrim planning their journey, both fingertips separated by centuries but united by curiosity. Digital restorations let us see these works as their creators intended before time faded their blues to gray or flaked away their gold. What emerges isn't just preserved history, but revitalized dialogue between past and present, where every pixel holds the potential to rediscover what it meant to map a world still half wrapped in myth. The monsters at the edges haven't vanished. They've simply migrated to the uncharted territories between data points, reminding us that some mysteries outlast even the most advanced technology. The greatest trick of medieval mapmakers wasn't their artistry or even their courage, it was their ability to turn fear into fascination. As we reach the edge of our journey, we're left not with answers, but with something far more valuable: the reminder that every map is a confession of human ambition. Those swirling dragons and golden cities weren't just decorations, they were mirrors held up to the soul of an era, reflecting a world where the unknown could be both terrifying and irresistible. These cartographers understood something we often forget, that the act of mapping is never neutral. Whether sketching a coastline or charting a life's path, we reveal what we value, what we fear, and where we dare to imagine the story might go next. Consider our modern equivalents, the glowing GPS grids on our phones, the heat maps tracking storms or pandemics. They may lack the inked serpents of the Hereford Mapper Mundi, but they're no less shaped by our biases and blind spots. Satellite imagery shows us every inch of the planet, yet we still argue over borders drawn with the same symbolic certainty as medieval mapmakers circling Jerusalem in gold. Even our digital unknowns have their own mythology. The blank spots where Wi-Fi signals fade become the new "Here be dragons," humming with the same mix of dread and possibility. What medieval mapmakers gifted us wasn't just geography, but a language for wrestling with the ungraspable. Their monsters were metaphors for the limits of knowledge, their empty spaces invitations rather than failures. In an age obsessed with data and deliverables, there's profound wisdom in their willingness to say, beyond this point, the story isn't finished. That's why their maps still resonate, not as antiquities but as provocations. They challenge us to ask, what uncharted territories linger in our own lives? What legends have we scribbled onto the margins of our understanding? So as we roll up these parchment visions and return to our pixel-perfect world, let's carry forward their boldest lesson, that a map's true purpose isn't to eliminate mystery, but to make the journey toward it meaningful. Your turn now. What dragons guard the edges of your world? Share your stories below, and until our next adventure into history's hidden corners, keep charting boldly. The most fascinating discoveries often begin just beyond the last ink.